In the last video, you learned how authentication works in custom Microsoft Teams apps. And in this video, we're going to talk about how to implement the pop-up page authentication flow in custom Microsoft Teams tab custom solutions. In your Microsoft Teams tab, you must first configure your identity provider. In a scenario where Azure Active Directory is your selected identity provider, you need to register a new Azure AD application and define the permissions that the application needs. The user is required to consent to these permissions to the application when they first sign in to the application. The Microsoft Teams JavaScript SDK contains an API to start the pop-up window authentication process. The Microsoft Teams .authentication.authenticate method takes a single configuration object as a parameter, and you can use this configuration object to specify the URL of the page that starts the authentication flow and the success and the failure callback handlers when the process completes. If the authentication process failed, Microsoft Teams reports back with the error. There are two predefined failure reasons that are specific to Microsoft Teams. Canceled by user is a reason that indicates that the user closed the pop-up window before they completed the authentication flow, while the failed to open window is the reason that indicates that Microsoft Teams was unable to open the pop-up window. When Microsoft Teams runs in a browser, this error usually indicates that the window is blocked by the browser's pop-up blocker. You're also free to provide your own authentication failure reasons. If the authentication process succeeded, you can refresh or reload the page to show the content relevant to the newly authenticated user or display the error reason. Now let's look at this authentication pop-up page a little bit more. The primary goal of this pop-up page is to redirect the user to get the configured identity providers to the sign-in. With this pop-up page, you can avoid the limitation that many identity providers don't allow their sign-in forms to be loaded within an iframe. This pop-up page can be handled in one of two ways. You can implement a server-side sign-in process by redirecting the user to the identity provider's sign-in page by using the HTTP 302 redirect response. You can also use a client-side option. To implement the client-side option, use the window.location.assign method to change the URL of the current page to the identity provider's sign-in page. To specify a sign-in hint with an identity provider such as Azure AD, retrieve the user's principal name from the current Microsoft Teams context. The OAuth 2 implicit grant flow calls for state parameter in the authentication request. This parameter contains a string that's unique to the session that you can use to prevent a cross-site request forgery attack. The state can be a random string that you'll check when you receive the authentication response from the identity provider. Only accept the response from the identity provider if the provided state property contents match the value you submitted in the initial request. If the two state values don't match, you might be the target of a CSRF attack. Now that we've covered the authentication process, let's look at the relevant code for each of the parts involved in the pop-up window pattern. The code on this slide is triggered by the user action, such as selecting a button within the configuration tab or the content page itself. It uses the Microsoft Teams JavaScript SDK to call the authenticate method, and this method sets the size of the pop-up window, the success and the failure callbacks, and the initial URL for the pop-up page. The authentication page loaded within the pop-up window has one job. It redirects the user to the chosen identity provider's sign-in page. The code uses Azure Active Directory Authentication Library, or ADAL, to handle this process. You must specify the ID of the application as the client ID, and you must also specify the URL of the page that Azure AD should redirect the user to after they finish the sign-in process. Notice the code overrides the display call method. This method gives you a chance to change the URL that the user is redirected to when the login method is called. In this case, we've included the scope parameter on the request to ensure that Azure AD includes an ID token that contains information about the newly authenticated user. And then finally, the login method is called to start the authentication process. The login method redirects the user to the Azure AD authorization endpoint. After the user has finished the authentication process with Azure AD, they're redirected back to a specified redirect URL, whether they succeeded or failed in the authentication process. This code uses the adal.js library to check if the user successfully signed in by trying to retrieve the current user by calling the auth context.getCached method. If so, it then redirects an Auth2 access token from Azure AD for the specified resource. In this case, the code requests an access token for Microsoft Graph. If a token is received, notify Microsoft Teams of a successful authentication flow and return the access token by calling Notify Success method. If a token wasn't received, notify the tab by calling Notify Failure with the specified error. Calling either of these methods triggers Microsoft Teams to close the pop-up window and run your previously defined callback functions. Silent authentication in Azure AD is a simplified form of single sign-on. Its purpose is to minimize the number of times the user needs to enter sign-in credentials while using your app. If you want to keep your code client-side, you can use adal.js to attempt to acquire an Azure AD access token silently. And in this case, the user might never see a pop-up dialog box if they signed in recently. The adal.js library creates a hidden iframe for the Auth2 implicit grant flow, but it specifies prompt equals none so that Azure AD never shows the sign-in page. If a user interaction is required because the user needs to sign in or grant access to the application, Azure AD immediately returns an error that adal.js will then report to your app. And at this point, your app can show a sign-in button if it's needed. If silent authentication fails, Azure AD returns an error that can be handled via adal.js and your application. In this scenario, your custom tag falls back to an interactive sign-in by using the pop-up window pattern.